Are vaccines really that important to your horse? It, you know, do we really need them? And do your horses benefit from them? How do they work? And why is there so much vaccine hesitancy in today's world in the 2020s? Just to start this video podcast off, I just want to kind of give you a story because it kind of shows you how vaccines have saved horses' lives. Going back to 2001, so this is over 2 decades ago, I was sitting there in the Central Valley of California. Hot, summers and mild winters. But as we entered the autumn or fall, I remember Dr. Ann Rodick, who was my mentor and advisor, incredible horsewoman, and has made so many positive impacts in my life. She asked me my opinion, which, as a young graduate student, you're like, wow, oh, she really does care about my opinion. And we were just having a discussion, and she was like, Chris, do we want to vaccinate our herd this year for this virus that was introduced into the United States? This virus showed up in the late 1990s, so around 1998, 1999, around New York City. And we were hearing about this disease that could kill up to 40% of horses. But it was isolated to the eastern United States. And here I was on the west coast of the United States in California. In 2000, that virus started to spread rapidly. And I think some of us, after all of us have lived through the COVID era, the post-COVID era, we can kind of understand, but that spread so quickly in a matter of months. This virus took a couple of years, and I'll explain why. And then we saw this virus start popping up in Florida. Now, humans are not a vector for this virus, meaning they don't carry it. I mean, I know and after living in Florida for 10 years, we would get what we call snowbirds, people coming down to winter in Florida from Canada and the northern United States. But it wasn't snowbirds, it was actual birds that were the vector. And they were migrating south down into Florida, carrying this virus. And then slowly each year, this virus started marching west. And people were getting sick, but not dying. This wasn't like COVID. This was a virus that birds would carry. A mosquito would suck the blood of a bird and then go and bite a horse, and it would be transmitting that virus. And it started to march westwards, and it was killing a lot of horses along the way. This virus is called the West Nile virus, and many of you that live in North America now understand, or other parts of the world, down in Africa and maybe parts of Europe, this virus is pretty deadly to horses. But it was an interesting outbreak that, as I was starting my career in academia and science, that we saw this virus march across the United States. And we sat there in 2001, 2002 thinking, do we vaccinate? There was a vaccine available because this is a global virus. This isn't something that just popped out of nowhere like COVID. And Dr. Rodick was wondering if we should hedge our bets. Would it be coming next year? Would the virus be found in California the next year? And funny enough, she did hedge her bets, and we did vaccinate the herd, which wasn't cheap. I mean, you're talking 80 something horses of brood mares, young horses, or stallions. We had a couple riding horses, but mainly a breeding operation there. And we did vaccinate. She decided, no, it's better to vaccinate, rather be safe than sorry, right? Preventative medicine. And the next year, we did see the first case of West Nile show up in California in 2003. Now, not everybody vaccinated their horses. So in 2004, so this is 20 years ago, 540 horses were infected with the West Nile virus, 229 of which died or were euthanized. In 2005, the next year, so it was there. People knew it was there. There was a big push by veterinarians and all the organizations in the West Coast of the United States, throughout the United States, throughout Americas and Canada, to vaccinate your horses. But still in 2005, 456 horses were infected with West Nile, which 200 died. Now in 2006, so this was 2+ years later, that dropped drastically to only 58 infections and 24 deaths. In 2007, so again, this is 4 years roughly that the virus showed up on the Western United States, 28 horses infected, 14 deaths. And then by 2020, just a few years ago, 20 cases with 5 deaths. So we went from hundreds of horses in the state of California being infected and dying to just a small handful. And why? What changed? The disease is still there. It's still in the environment. And that's because the vaccine. And that's because horses were vaccinated against West Nile virus and are able to withstand that disease if they're infected by a mosquito. And they're able to fight it off, much like, we've all experienced with COVID. And in this podcast, I just ask for you to stick with me today. We're going to talk about some vaccine hesitancy. What other horse owners are saying, why they won't vaccinate. Why have the rules changed for equine flu with a lot of competition organizations around the world? How do these vaccines work? How long do they give us coverage for? Also going to talk about what to vaccinate against, your cores and then your at-risk horses. And then your, depends on what region you live in. And then how to manage the horse after, how long the vaccine might make them feel a little off for a few days. But talking about vaccines, and I know vaccines have been, these last few years has been a roller coaster in the media, social media, wherever you look online. And I'm going to touch a little bit about why there's a controversy. But again, that's not my fight. It's not your fight. It's not our horse's fight to talk about vaccines, especially in the human medicine world. But I will give you some data and some information. But we are seeing some of that hesitancy now with our horses, which is very disheartening from a medical standpoint, from a veterinarian standpoint. And we're going to talk about that. And I want to ask you to give me any feedback, anything that I say in this video podcast, or you feel like, hey, this is an issue you need to discuss further, or you just want to give me some comments, please email me podcast@madbarn.com. I do read those emails. I am emailing listeners back. So please don't hesitate. If there's something in here that you're like, hey, I wasn't quite clear on that, or do you ever think about it from this standpoint? Because I feel you. I feel in this information age that we live in now, and that's the 21st century, the information, it's overwhelming. I feel like we're getting too much information, and it gets overwhelming. So I feel you. But this one is such an important topic. And if you do share it, or you do remind your friends, hey, vaccinate your horses, because we could prevent things like tetanus, which 80% of horses die. It's a horrific disease. It's a horrible way to die for an animal. And it's just one simple vaccine a year will prevent them from ever experiencing that. And tetanus is everywhere in the world. And horses are particularly at risk because they live outdoors or around places where they do get small cuts or puncture wounds. And tetanus is horrible. Rabies, talk a little bit about that data. But if a horse gets infected with rabies, and yes, they get rabies, because a rabid, we think of dogs with rabies, but a fox, a raccoon, a skunk could bite a horse out in pasture, spread rabies, and that horse dies horribly, and it's 100% fatal. So these are diseases that we can prevent against with one simple shot that's not that expensive. It really isn't. In the overall scheme of horse care and costs, vaccines are cheap, very cheap, compared to the costs of supportive care, going to the veterinarian, having to euthanize your animal, having to dispose of your horses. Oh, it's horrible. And it's expensive. And many of you have experienced that. So that's why I, again, try to be a voice for those that can't talk for themselves, and those are horses. Okay, let's finish out the West Nile virus story. So in the United States, roughly over the 20 years when West Nile first showed up, and this is some data out of Rutgers University, roughly 27,600 US horses have been infected with the West Nile virus. Now, we see a lot of that early on because people just didn't know there was a vaccine, or didn't know that this was really going on. And the next thing they know, their horses are sick and have a neurological disease. And the veterinarian's out trying to treat it, probably saying, oh, it's this new disease that's out there. And I said up to 40% of horses die from West Nile virus. Now, we saw it march across the United States. By 2005, there was cases throughout the country. Some human cases, some horse cases. We really saw a peak in 2012, which is surprising because it had been out for 8 to 10 years, but 627 horses were reported to be infected with West Nile virus. So that's a little bit over 10 years ago. In the last few years, we see those numbers peaking anywhere from 300 to 400 per year, down to 71 in 2020, 220 in 2021. I don't have data past that. So it is still out there. Horses are still getting infected with it. And it's probably people that just aren't vaccinating their animals. They're just not, or vaccines don't work all the time. At the end of the podcast, I'll talk about storage, how your veterinarian should be storing them, or if you vaccinate yourself, how you should be storing them. Because if they are improperly stored, the vaccines won't work. If they get cooked or anything like that. We'll talk about that. But West Nile virus, just in California, like I said, it peaked in 2005, and then in 2020 there was only 20 cases or 5. So we saw those numbers drop drastically once people started vaccinating. And in California, you're talking about 1 million horses. It's a huge state with a lot of horses. So to only have 20 be infected, that's pretty low. So that means it's a really good uptake of the vaccine, and the veterinarians out there are doing a tremendous job, treating these horses. And to see a horse with a neurological disease is horrible. Just to tell you a quick story, when I was training students on riding, when I was doing my PhD down in Texas, it was Parsons Mountain Cavalry, Texas A&M. This is the honorary group that we taught them as sophomores how to ride, and then their junior, senior years, they were out there riding in parades around Texas. Before every football game, they would march in and things like that. And so it was fun. And we had about I think I heard about 40 riding horses, if I remember right. And one day, or week, we were out there, and one of our geldings, he just was stumbling a little bit. And I was like, uh-oh, did he have a lameness, something like that? Gave him some rest, came out the next day, and this horse was like a drunken sailor, excuse the pun, very wobbly, couldn't balance himself, had trouble walking, obviously had something wrong neurologically. Called the veterinarian. Again, very lucky that we had one of the top vet hospitals in the state just around the corner at the university, where we could just trailer horses right over, 5-10 minutes away. Could get the horse collapsed on his hind end in the trailer, like could barely stand. That's how bad the neurological disease advanced. And all of our horses were vaccinated against West Nile, but for some reason this horse got a neurological disease, and we suspected West Nile virus for some. That's what I think the veterinarians fed back to us. Took him to the vet hospital, started giving him supportive care. The vet bills were going to come in, and they decided to euthanize the horse because he was almost too far gone for any sort of rehabilitation, and the vet bills were going to be outstanding. They couldn't afford it. The Mountain Cavalry couldn't afford the thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars it was going to take to support this one horse that might not ever be able to be ridden again. So when you experience something like that, it sticks with you, and you're like, wow, okay, I should be vaccinating my horses. Now, this brings up the issue of vaccine hesitancy, and I want to tackle this head on because we are now, as a culture around the world, people are hesitant to vaccinate their animals now. Not only people or children, and I'm a father, and when all of this was coming out, over a decade ago about vaccines and MMR and autism and the preservatives, and I did talk to I was a scientist. I mean, reproductive physiologist, biologist, but I did talk to my pediatrician before I vaccinated my eldest, and I said, hey, I know there's a lot in the news because this was 2011, and I just said, and I just asked her, what are you hearing back? What's the data showing? And she said, it's Chris, it's fine. Your son's gonna be fine. They've actually changed the preservatives, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So even me as a scientist who, vaccinate animals, no problem, but I vaccinated my son and I'm like, And, I had some hesitancy because of the information age, because I was overwhelmed that, wow, is there something there? Now, as I've dug deeper and deeper and looked into the research and like, wow, what I'll talk about there in a second. But some of you are like, oh, I vaccinate, no problem. But some of you watching this are like, wow, I really don't know if I should vaccinate my horse. Do other people feel that way? And yes, some do. I mean, some people are hesitant to vaccinate their animals. We love these animals so much. They're our children. Like me with my oldest son, we may not, feel like, oh, should I be giving them this or not? So there was a survey done in Australia, and it was the title, Why Won't They Just Vaccinate? Horse Owner Risk Perception and Uptake of the Hendra Virus Vaccine. Okay, so this is a very specific disease that is horrible, by the way. In Australia, it is very rare, so keep that in mind as I talk about this. But it does kill people. This is one of the very few, if not the only one I can think of off the top of my head, disease that a horse can have that can kill its owner. Not by biting, just you being around them, touching them. It's in their fluids, bodily fluids. Somehow they get it, and humans have died from this disease, the Hendra virus. Now, in this study, this was just a couple years ago, up to 70% of horse owners in Australia have vaccinated against the Hendra virus. And these researchers from there were wondering, why aren't people vaccinated against this? Their health is at risk. Not only will it kill your horse, it will kill you. And people are hesitant. Now, in 1994, this virus was discovered and it killed a horse trainer, and 14 of his horses died. And then later, this is all in Queensland, which I was just there a few weeks back. In the northern part of Queensland, another farmer and horse breeder died. So, and then a third person died from this. Now, the way it's spread is there's flying foxes, big bats in Australia, and it was in their, they think it's in their urine. The bats go around and urinate on pasture. A horse gets it, either eating or grazing, and then they have the virus. And then the horse owner's around them, and the horse owner picks it up. So that's how they think it's being spread. But veterinarians and other health officials in Australia are frustrated because horse owners aren't vaccinating against this disease, because not only are you worried about horse health, but you're also worried about owner health, veterinarian health, farrier health. Anybody around that horse, if they're infected, could be at risk of death. So it's very serious. But they went in and asked, why are you not vaccinating? Now, the three main themes or the concerns with this. So they went and asked 210 people that aren't vaccinating their horse, and they're like, okay, why? Why won't you vaccinate? The first big concern is attitude towards the vaccine. I think all of us living through COVID, all of us having to deal with that decision to vaccinate or not, hearing in the news, no matter where you live in the world, about the vaccines, about mRNA vaccines, and we were bombarded with information. You had a lot of anti-vax movement stand up and everything. So I could understand where that would bleed over into our animals. Like, hey, I don't know. This was a new vaccine for the Hendra vaccine. People think it's not effective yet. If they asked, why? Okay, so why? Why do you have this attitude towards the vaccine? To quote some of these people, quote, I only vaccinated due to pressure from vets, but I'm now reconsidering due to risk factors and my horse's reaction to the vaccine each time it was given. Unquote. That's what one person said. Another person said, quote, there have been more cases of a reaction to the vaccine than there is of a horse contracting the virus. The reactions I've heard or read about are quite confronting and scary, which made me reconsider, unquote. And then another one, finally, quote, concerns from social media with side effects means that at present I have not done our miniature horse, unquote. Okay, so social media, information age, being bombarded with info. People are like, this vaccine, plus there's bad reactions to it. So I don't want to do it because that goes into the next theme, risk assessment. So people were saying it's very rare. The risk is very low. So why am I going to, vaccinate my horse and then have these horrible side effects, right? So to quote what they said, quote, I believe that the infection rate of both horses and humans to be statistically insignificant. The virus has been around forever. Why the panic now? Does someone know something I don't? Awareness and PPE covers risks, unquote. So protective gear, handling horses, things like that. So people were saying they'll take more strict biosecurity measures rather than vaccinate their horse. Okay, and then the third one was attitude towards authorities, which again we've heard a lot of in the last few years, and lockdowns. And I'll say something too in this video. I'm probably one of the few people on earth that have been locked down in 3 different countries during COVID. My own personal story. I was locked down in the USA at the initial. I made it over to the UK to be with my partner. I was locked down there with her while I fought to get back into New Zealand because place was shut down like, Fort Knox. And I made it into New Zealand, did my 2 weeks in quarantine, and then got out, and then we were locked down again. So I was locked down in 3 different countries. So I get it. I wasn't happy, and lockdowns weren't fun, but it's what we did. We all lived through it, and we all had experience through that. So when it comes to horses, vaccine hesitancy, these owners are saying, quote, the fact people are trying to force us to vaccinate, vets are refusing to treat horses that are unvaccinated. Some grounds will not allow horses that are unvaccinated, right? They can't ride or compete. The amount of things being swept under the rug and the lies being told around by the vaccinating company and vets that are reading from the same song sheet, unquote. So pushing back against authority, people saying you need to do this, saying, no, I don't, and I'm not going to. Okay. So, then they asked them some questions. If the vaccine was free, would you vaccinate your horse? These, again, owners that refused because costs were an issue. Let me see, that is close to 40% said they would. Another 16% they were unsure. So cost could be there. If one of their horses became infected, would they vaccinate? That jumped close to 50%, and then another 21% said they weren't sure. But 20% were still, no, I won't vaccinate, even if one of their horses next to them has it. So those are the ones you can't win over. You just can't. You can't convince them of anything. And then they just went, if the vet told them, even if their vet recommended it, only 10% would say they would do it. So people were pretty, when it came to the Hendra virus, they were pretty, significant, they were pretty adamant they weren't going to do it. And again, that's because only 3 people died or 4 people died, right? So if it was 4 to 10 people a year, my goodness, for sure they probably would. Okay. But that's just a very rare disease. Another one, equine flu. Just like human flu, it is not as deadly. Less than 1% of horses die. But again, like, our population, young and old, are very, susceptible to severe illness. So geriatric horses, young horses give equine flu, or they can have a really bad time. But flu is something that is recommended, every year, especially in places like the United Kingdom and Europe. And if you compete, it's compulsory. You have to have your horse vaccinated for equine flu. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that here in a second on why. It's think about it with like COVID. Okay, we lived through all the COVID area, all of us. We all had to wear masks or all that stuff. How highly infectious COVID was, sneezing, coughing, runny nose, so bodily fluids. That's how COVID was spread. That's how equine flu is spread too between horses. That's how human flu spread between us, right? So are owners hesitant with equine flu? This paper just published a couple years ago, Equine Influenza Vaccination as reported by horse owners and factors influencing their decisions to vaccinate or not. Okay. So why aren't they vaccinating their horses against flu? That's 20% out of all those horse owners. And a lot of them said, my horse doesn't compete. A lot of them that didn't vaccinate. I don't take my horse to horse competitions. So maybe they're not at risk. Maybe they're not being exposed to others. And, it's personal reasons. If my horse isn't at risk, and I guess there is core vaccines that vets say every horse needs, like tetanus, rabies, we'll cover those. West Nile virus in the United States and Canada, Mexico. Then there are the at-risk vaccines, which equine flu, at least in North America, is considered at risk. In Europe and in the UK or down here in Australia, New Zealand, the equine flu is one that they always recommend every year. So why this hesitancy? What's the genesis of this? And again, I said it's not my fight, but to give you the idea, vaccine hesitancy has been around since we started vaccinating or inoculating against diseases. Really, the history of vaccines is very, very interesting when you study the history and look back. Smallpox was a pretty virulent disease that killed 3 out of 10 people that got it. And there was no vaccines available. They estimate in the 1900s, from 1900 to 1999, close to maybe upwards of 500 million people, or until 1990, because it was eradicated. In 1980, I'll start all that again. Okay. Scientists estimate in the 1900s, smallpox alone killed upwards of 500 million people around the world until it was eradicated in 1979. So this was a horrible disease that marked your face and your body. It was terrible. So Edward Jenner was a physician back in the late 1790s. And what he did is he inoculated a young boy with a cowpox. It's very similar, but wouldn't infect him like smallpox, the human version. So his body, when he'd go and inoculate, so they make little cuts and then smear some of the cowpox on, so his body took it, his immune system made antigens to fight this cowpox which then in turn gave him immunity to fight off smallpox. So that inoculation started the whole vaccine development into the 1800s. So they started to produce a smallpox vaccine, but again, wasn't widely available in the world until the later 1900s, 1950s, 60s, 70s, that it was eradicated in 1979 and smallpox is gone. So that nobody's getting sick from smallpox anymore due to the smallpox vaccine. 500 million people died from this disease, but now we have nobody dying from it because of a vaccine. Now, the anti-vax movement, this is something I highly suggest, if you're really interested in it, research it on your own. In 1998, a paper by Andrew Wakefield and then all the other authors pulled their names off the study. This paper was published in the Lancet. It was talking about links of the MMR vaccine to autism. One little study, I believe, if I remember right, it was like 12 subjects, and he was interviewing the family looking for signs of autism. It was not a robust study by any stretch of the imagination, and there's a lot of background to it that I'm not going to get into because it's not really that pertinent. But what it did, okay, that study came out and it scared everybody off the MMR vaccine. In 2011, asking my pediatrician, which she probably every time a parent was going to vaccinate their kids, probably got fielded that. And I said, hey, what do you think? I just want to, just before we vaccinate my son, where are we with this? Because I didn't have the information. I didn't do the deep dives that I've done since after that. So that paper led to billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars in research to disprove that vaccines are not linked with autism. Again, not my fight, not what this is meant, this whole topic, vaccines and horses, okay? But that started it, that now we're inundated with social media during the whole COVID pandemic all around the world. You saw massive pushback, a lot of people very, vocal about vaccines. Okay, so that's the genesis of the anti-vax movement. But again, that was going on for centuries. People with the smallpox vaccine, there was pushback with that. Even though it was saving millions of lives, there was a lot of pushback. Polio, we eradicated polio, but now that might be coming back. So it's just something that research for yourselves and go down that road. I recommend it. You learn a lot. Where I am with horses, I'm an advocate for them, and I'm an advocate for your veterinarians. I've trained many veterinarians. I've trained many undergraduate students that have gone on to be veterinarians, helped guide them to get into vet school. A lot of my graduate students have gone on to go to vet school and now are DVMs. I made a decision, I'll talk about this in a future podcast about equine vets, not to go to vet school. I went the PhD route because I love teaching. I love science in a different way. And I was wondering how my life would be different if I did go down that route. But for me, it was more of a financial decision because equine vets don't make a ton of money. Some do really well, and we'll talk about that in a future podcast. But a lot of them don't. I mean, they struggle, and the ones I've worked with, they were struggling to make a decent living. That there are many other jobs after 4 years of medical school that they could be making 5 times the amount that they were making, because these are very bright students that could have gotten to human medicine, but their love for horses or their love for animals propelled them into vet school. So they don't get rich, despite what some people think. They also don't get kickbacks from pharmaceutical industries. I worked in the pharma industry before I went to graduate school, and I was making very good money, and I gave it up because I love animals like your veterinarians. I had a really good humming territory. I was visiting human medicine. This was human medicine. I was visiting human doctors, making a very good salary. And even human doctors weren't making bank from the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, we were funding some research at the universities, but not your general day-to-day doctor. I was not passing them $1,000 checks to write prescriptions. I mean, no, that's unethical and it was illegal. So this idea that the pharma industry is pushing your veterinarians to vaccinate to make money is laughable. Not happening, especially with your equine vets. Let me protect them at least. No way. That is not happening. And the reason I say this is because your veterinarians, whether they're small animal, large animal, their lives are stressful enough, 24/7 on call. They're out there helping your animals. They're there in the middle of the night dealing with colics. During foaling season, they're up at all hours, caring for these sick mares, sick babies, whatever it is. They give it their all. And I say this because there was an opinion piece that I ran across. It's very snarky, and it triggered me a little bit because I think it's a little bit unfair. And the title was "Why I Won't Be Following the New Equine Vaccine Regime." And the subtitle is, "The vet has admitted that extra dose of the flu jab doesn't confer any additional immunity." This was published a couple years ago in The Spectator by an opinion person. She's a horsewoman. I mean, she rides horses, and I don't know what else she writes about, but it was a snarky article, and it really, I disagree a lot with what she had to say. And I don't think her vet said that, or she misheard her vet, because what she said is not true. And what she was referencing is in competition horses, they now require 2 doses of equine flu each year. And I'll explain why in a minute. It is based in science. To quote her, but this is the snarky part. So, quote, "In terms of immunity," said the young girl as she put the used syringes back into the boot of a 4x4 that she didn't look old enough to drive, "it obviously doesn't make any difference." And then she puts in brackets, "The vets are now so young, you have to help them," on brackets. "I'm sorry, what?" I asked. That's the author. "Well, obviously they don't need vaccinated every 6 months. It's just the rules have changed," said the vet. And then she goes on to say, "I suppose the rule change will, coincidentally, make everyone involved, from vets to vaccine manufacturers, a nice pile of money. But all the same," I said, "I would ring and make an appointment as usual next year." All right, let me put that in perspective. First of all, she's, complaining about a young veterinarian. Well, let me tell you what, take care of your veterinarians, because they deal with a lot, and a lot of them do leave the industry because of the stress. And we need veterinarians. We are losing vets. They're in high demand around the world, losing them to foreign countries, losing them to industry, other industries, whether it's biomedical or whatever, because dealing with us horse owners, dealing with people day to day, and then again, not making that great of a living. It's really, they're not making tons of money. And I find it laughable that a nice pile of money, quote unquote, that is a joke. The vets come out, charge a nominal fee. They probably spent half of that in gas just to get to your property and vaccinate your horse and then go off, or you do it yourself. And vaccines are not that expensive. And that's not what's driving it. So that perception around vaccines and some of our preventative health care is what really hurts the industry, and will cost horses their lives. It will absolutely cost horses their lives. If you convince people not to vaccinate, not to do this preventative deworming, or some of these other things that are based in science and medical facts, we're in a world of hurt. These poor animals will suffer when they don't need to. Now, to get to the flu vaccine, why? Okay, well, first we have to understand how vaccines work, because now that these horses require it twice per year, and why are all the competitions in the United States, in Europe, and in Australia, where this was referencing, why? Why? Well, it was particularly with the equine flu, there's 2 types generally given. Okay, the first type is inactivated or killed vaccine. So this is the virus, but it's dead. And what that means is the virus, when it's introduced via vaccine, cannot infect your horse, cannot replicate and make your horse sick. Okay, they don't get the disease. It doesn't trigger the disease and then the virus replicates and then the horse is really ill. But what it does is it triggers the immune system to react. So the horse may feel a little ill. After I get a flu vaccine, sometimes I feel a little off for a day or two. My shoulder's sore. I mean, absolutely, where they give it. And my immune system's kicked in to high gear. It's producing antibodies. And that way, if I come across the live virus, my body's already primed to fight it. Boom, kills the virus off, and I don't get ill, right? The other type of flu that's intranasal now, so we spray it in the nose, is a modified live vaccine. Okay, so that gets a little scary once you talk these science fiction stuff, but it's done perfectly safe. Millions of horses are given this every year. And the virus is modified that it can't replicate. So the horse does get a little sick, or again, the immune system kicks in, get a strong immune response, and then when the non-modified live virus, if they ever come across it, the horse can fight it off right away. So there is a lot of information out there on vaccines, modified live, why that's not scary. The University of Guelph has a horse care sheet. What is a modified live vaccine? Dr. Amy Bennett talks about it, the fears that people have. I get it. Science, if you're not in it, and some of the things I could talk about probably blow your mind away when I talk about cloning and all the things that we were doing in the lab. You're like, oh my goodness, it's a science fiction film. But these vaccines are produced to protect your horse, and they're up to date. So less horses are getting sick, less vaccine failure, and horses are getting longer coverage. That's another big thing. So begs the question, why 2 times a year? A lot of times we were just giving the flu vaccine once a year. We get the flu vaccine once a year, usually before the fall or autumn, going into winter, when chances are we're going to get sick, right? We're indoors more, it's wet, our bodies are fighting off different bugs, we're around more people inside, we're not getting fresh air and sun. So that's where flu likes to circulate. It's just like COVID. We're all trained now to these infectious diseases. So when you think of COVID and how that spread, that's how flu spreads, right? So that's why we would get our vaccines right before then, and we mount this strong immune response, but it goes away. It doesn't stick with us. It's not lifelong immunity. It lasts about 4 to 6 months. And then our immune system's kind of back, maybe just a little bit above what was. But then if you get it again, boom, you get that strong immune response. Okay, and then that takes a while to dissipate. Then strong immune response. So just really quick, there was a quick study, impacts of mixed equine influenza vaccination on correlate of protection in horses. This was actually done out of Morocco. Very interesting study, giving different vaccines, looking at the immune response to equine flu. You get that initial, and this was in yearlings, right? So their immune systems are what we call naive, never exposed to this virus, right? So you give them an initial dose and the immune system's like, whoa, what's this? And then you give them that booster dose, and that's what really takes off with the immune system. And the body fights it. And then once your immune system is just incredible. Once your immune system has that memory, because it does, every year you just give one booster. And going into fall, winter, autumn, winter, you'll get that coverage that dissipates kind of spring, summer, but then again, right? So that's why we give for horses for a long time one flu vaccine before then, covers them, and then spring, summer, they're generally okay. But for competition horses, where we've seen tons of disease outbreaks throughout the world that is shutting down competitions because of equine flu, or there's others, EHV, equine herpes virus, that you get these outbreaks and all of a sudden all the horses are in quarantine, the show's canceled, all that money spent, or the next weekend show's canceled, the week after that's canceled. It's cost millions and millions of dollars, not to so much the shows, it's to you. All that money you spend trailering your horse, all that fuel, accommodations, fees, everything is out the window because a horse comes up sick with flu. And you could prevent this with one simple vaccine. So that is why you're seeing now competitions and competitive horses getting flu vaccines twice a year. So you keep that coverage high. throughout the year. So chances are they won't get sick, or they come and they, aren't carrying disease or won't be able to spread it as rapidly. And then the other one that all competitors need twice per year is the equine herpes virus. If you're confused, always check with your veterinarian. What vaccines do I need, especially if you're showing wherever you live in the world. There's also a very good article on madbarn.com, Vaccination Guide for Horses, Schedule and List of Equine Vaccines. It talks about newer second generation vaccines that are coming on the market. If you want to learn more about that, but these are some of those DNA, mRNA type vaccines. What are they? And you can look at that and see the different types, and then different types of diseases that we want to vaccinate for. But I'm going to talk about our vaccine schedule now, who, what, when. And I would always say, talk to your veterinarian wherever you are in the world. They're going to know what diseases are endemic in your area. They're going to know what vaccinations your horses will need each year, because it's going to differ from where you live in the world, or even parts of the country. Different regions have different diseases. But in general, we talk about the core vaccines that all horses need, and then our risk-based vaccines. So core vaccines, these are the ones that can result in severe illness or death. Preventative medicine. The risks are, again, these competition horses, or say you're sending your broodmare out to a breeding farm. Another story, and I've talked about this in a previous podcast, brought in an outside mare to our farm in Texas, had over 100 horses on our farm. Strangles went through the entire herd there. Had like all of our brood mares, everybody had strangles. And it was because we brought in an outside horse, and our waters were set between two fences. So it just went from this pasture to that pasture to this pasture to that pasture. Next thing we know, we had a strangles outbreak. And that's something you can vaccinate against. But that was an at-risk disease, right? That horse should have been vaccinated for. First one, tetanus, talked about it. Vaccinate your horse, please, once a year. It is not a good prognosis. If the horse gets it, up to 80% will die. You're talking thousands in vet bills and care. Tetanus is the neurotoxin produced by the bacterium Clostridium tetani. That's everywhere in the soil in the world. It's here, it's there, wherever you are, outside, it's everywhere. And thousands of horses per year, about 1% each year of equine cases worldwide are tetanus cases. So horrible death. They get lockjaw. They can't open their jaw. It's terrible. And it's one easy vaccine that has been effective for decades. So that is one every single horse in the world needs every year, period. Now, rabies, another horrific disease just popping up in the US. I saw this headline before I started putting this together just last week, February 29th, 2024. Tennessee horse positive for rabies. In the middle of the United States, they've had a couple cases of rabies. These are, like I said, a rabid fox, a rabid skunk, a rabid raccoon, or a bat, a dog bites a horse. They have rabies. The horse gets it. It's 100% fatal in horses. One vaccine can prevent that horse from dying with it. So that's a core vaccine that is yearly that horses need. Now, rabies isn't everywhere. We don't have rabies here where I live. In the United Kingdom, they're rabies free. Fiji, certain islands, Belgium, Australia, rabies free. So certain places don't have rabies, you don't need to vaccinate for, right? Unless I'm flying my horse from Australia to the United States, which could happen for competitions or something like that, that horse doesn't need a rabies vaccine. But again, if they're at risk, traveling to a place with it, yes. But if they're living their entire life in Australia, they don't need a rabies vaccine. Okay. So those are the big ones. Then West Nile virus, that is one in North America every horse owner should get. It's a big one. Again, because of the vaccine, hundreds of horses' lives have been saved, if not thousands, in the United States. Yeah, probably thousands per year, easily. And then just to finish out the Americas, the other one is equine encephalitis. So you have the eastern and western strains. Those are neurological diseases. Horses, again, like West Nile virus, should be vaccinated against. So those are really your 5 core vaccines: your rabies, your tetanus, your eastern and western equine encephalitis, and then your West Nile virus. And that's the Americas. Now, in Europe or the United Kingdom, their vaccine schedules obviously are tetanus, and then if they need rabies or not, and then they recommend as a core vaccine equine herpes virus. So EHV, there's different strains, 1 and 4, EHV1 and EHV4, both can be problematic. Again, I dealt with it in reproduction because it causes abortion in mares. But that's one that they say to vaccinate against. And then equine flu. That's more of a risk-based one in the United States or in Canada or Mexico or even South America. If you're traveling, if you're going to competitions where horses can, nose-to-nose contact, or they share water or fences, anything like that where they might be at risk, there are a lot more vaccines. So things like rotavirus, leptospirosis, depends on where you are in the world, botulism, anthrax, strangles. That mare should have been, she should have been vaccinated against strangles. She wasn't. She had it. She spread it to our farm. We should have had all of our horses. They were at risk. That was a big learning curve for us at Texas A&M. But like I said, in the United States, herpes virus, influenza, those are competition horses. Potomac horse fever. That is one, if your vet says to vaccinate against, please do. That is one that is in certain parts of the United States. It's been discovered actually most of the United States and Canada, South America, and parts of Europe, and then India. So that is a disease that if your vet says, hey, it's in the area, you should vaccinate for, please do, because your horse is at risk. If you live in Australia, the Hendra virus, what's your life worth? What's your horse's life worth? They're pushing that. Your horse is at risk in Queensland, or where there are, flying foxes, where, this is in the environment. So listen to your veterinarians and, when to do this. Obviously, your young horses, your adult horses, and then your brood mares all have different vaccination schedules. Usually the foals and weanlings, you're going to need more doses of the vaccine. Because again, I talked about a naive immune system, never been exposed to it. So like you get it for the first time, I was like, whoa, what's this? It's trying to recognize it. Then you give a booster and it gets a big immune response, and then another booster to give them long lasting immunity. So they may need 3 doses, 2 doses on some vaccines. It just depends. Talk to your vet. Adult horses, generally annually, and I'm going to talk about when here in a second. And then brood mares, we always vaccinate, not only annually, but then about 4 to 6 weeks before their due date. And that's to boost colostrum production and boost mare health before that. Now, the AAEP, so this is the American Association of Equine Practitioners, has updated their vaccination recommendations in the last couple of years. And typically they said, and to quote them, traditionally veterinarians have vaccinated horses for core disease, except rabies and influenza, in the spring, and perform rabies vaccines and dental checkups in the fall. It's now recommended by the AAEP that vaccination for all core diseases happen in early spring. Late spring and summer are peak times for wildlife that can carry rabies. So they updated when, and then mosquitoes. That's when West Nile virus and the encephalitises can infect your horse. So that's timing. So that boost I talked about, that immune response, we want that high when the horses are going to be at most risk. And so that's why they're talking about late spring and summer. That's when you want those antibodies to be the highest. And, it used to be because they said because there was a time lag between a horse being bitten by a rabid animal and symptoms. That's why they weren't seeing it till fall or winter. They were thinking that's when they were bit. It's actually they're finding out that if they are going to be exposed, it's earlier in the year. Okay. So again, talk to your veterinarian and follow their recommendations. They're going to be the ones to help guide you wherever you are in the world. Now, some of the other questions is after a vaccine, when can my horse go back to normal? And there's been some studies. This one was published out of Denmark. Vaccination elicits a prominent acute phase response in horses, published about 10 years ago. But it was just talking about there's some inflammation, heart rate goes up. There is a response to a vaccine. And think about it. You're putting a virus, a foreign body in the bloodstream. The immune system's responding like it's infected, and it's fighting off a cold or a flu or something like that. So that's biology. That's normal. And by 96 hours, so you're looking at 3, 4, 5 days, horses are back to normal. That response, they see that graph it was within 2 days that peaked, and then by 4 days, it was going back to baseline. By 5 days, they should be okay. A veterinarian, this was published on Equine, when to exercise. They said after just a few days, give it a few days, light exercise, get those muscles moving. You know how whenever we get our vaccines and we're sore and get the muscle working a little bit to work it out. But within 2 to 3 days, they should be okay. Also check competition rules. Your vaccine should be given at least 7 days, depends on the organization, but the one I was reading, 7 days before a competition, because again, you need that immune response. You can't give it the day before. The vaccine won't be effective if your horse is sick. And just put a caveat in there too. If you do compete and your horse can't have the vaccine for whatever reason, you have to lobby the governing body to allow them. But they do. There's a bunch of rules that you can read online. Now, I did say earlier, vaccines do fail. If vaccines aren't stored properly or handled properly, they won't work. And one of the things is vaccines must be stored at proper temperatures of 35 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, a few degrees above Celsius, above zero. If they're kept in the open, in the sunlight, or too warm, it ruins the vaccine. They won't work. Or if you give it in the wrong place in the horse, so always, my recommendation is always read the manufacturer's instructions on how to store the vaccine and how to give it, right? So that is important to limit vaccine failure. Wrapping all this up, I want to be an advocate for your horses. They can't talk to you. Horses should not die from tetanus. Horses should not die from rabies, and every year they do. It's easily preventable with one simple shot per year. It's not that expensive, and it's not detrimental to your animal. Watching an animal suffer is something none of us should experience or want. Or, not vaccinating your animal and then faced with thousands and thousands of dollars in veterinary bills at a hospital to save your animal's life is also not nice, and it is tough. And owners are faced with that every single day. I know many of you watching have been faced with that. I've been faced with that. Do you spend the thousands of dollars to save this animal? And do you have it? That's the other thing. Do you have it? So, understand your veterinarians are only doing what's best for you and your animal. That's all they care about. That's why they got into veterinary medicine. And listen to them. We love these animals so much, and they really, really deserve our best effort. And we got to help them every way we can. Now, if you have any concerns, always talk to your vet. You can always email me, podcast@madbarn.com. Any questions, please go there. Check us out on social media, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, you name it, we're there. Mad Barn, you can go to the Mad Barn website, learn, go to the articles, and type in stuff on vaccines or anything health related with your horse, nutrition related with your horse. It's on there. And if you can click the subscribe button, that would make everybody at Mad Barn happy. And we just know that, we're on the right track. We're doing the right thing. And we're going to keep this information going. And give me your opinions. Please send them my way. Podcast@madbarn.com. I'd be really curious to see how you feel about this topic and anything else you might want me to cover. So take care and stay tuned to this channel for more.